The morning air was cool and calm when the small cafe on the corner opened its doors. The smell of fresh coffee slowly filled the room, while soft music played in the background. A few early customers sat quietly with their laptops or newspapers, enjoying the peaceful start of the day. At a small table near the window sat a single father and his young daughter. The sunlight came through the glass and rested softly on their table. The girl had a notebook open in front of her, along with a pencil and a half-finished muffin. Her father sat across from her with a cup of black coffee, watching her with patient eyes. The girl frowned at the page in front of her. "I don't understand this one," she said quietly, tapping the pencil against the notebook. Her father leaned forward and looked at the page. His face showed the tiredness of someone who worked long hours, but his voice was calm and warm. "You almost solved it," he said gently. "Look again at the last number." The girl studied the page again. A moment later her eyes brightened. "Oh, I see it now." She quickly erased something and wrote the new answer. Then she looked up proudly. "Is that right?" Her father nodded and smiled. "Perfect." The girl grinned and took another bite of her muffin. To anyone watching, the man looked completely ordinary. He wore simple jeans, a plain jacket, and boots that had clearly been used for years. There was nothing about him that made him stand out, but there was something steady about the way he carried himself. His back stayed straight in his chair, and his eyes moved calmly around the room every few minutes without making it obvious. It looked natural, almost automatic. A woman at the next table noticed how kind he was with the child. Every few minutes he pushed the milk closer to her, or wiped crumbs from the table. When she laughed, he laughed with her. The cafe felt warm and safe. Behind the counter, the barista worked on preparing drinks while chatting with another customer about the weather. A couple near the door spoke quietly while sharing a pastry. The quiet clinking of cups and spoons mixed with the soft music playing overhead. It was the kind of peaceful morning people wish would last all day. Then the door opened. The sound of the bell above the door rang sharply as a tall man walked inside. His heavy footsteps echoed across the floor. The peaceful mood in the cafe shifted almost instantly. He looked around the room with an impatient expression and walked straight to the counter. "I've been waiting 10 minutes for a parking spot outside," he said loudly. "You better make this coffee fast." The barista tried to stay polite. "Good morning. What can I get for you?" The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he sighed loudly and glanced around the room like everything irritated him. Finally, he ordered a large coffee and leaned against the counter while waiting. The father at the window table noticed the man, but didn't stare. He simply returned his attention to his daughter. "Finish the last question," he told her softly. "Then we'll walk you to school." The girl nodded and continued writing. At the counter, the impatient man watched the barista preparing his drink. Every few seconds, he tapped his fingers loudly on the counter. "Is it ready yet?" he asked. "It'll just be another minute," the barista replied calmly. The man rolled his eyes. "This place is slow." A few customers looked up, but quickly returned to their drinks. No one wanted to get involved in someone else's bad mood. The father quietly slid his daughter's backpack closer to her chair. "You packed your lunch?" he asked. She nodded. "And your reading book?" She opened the bag to check. "Yes." "Good." The girl smiled. "Can we stop here again tomorrow?" "If we're early enough," he replied. At that moment, the man at the counter grabbed his coffee and turned around quickly. As he walked toward the door, he wasn't paying attention to where he was going. His shoulder bumped into the father's table. The coffee cup tilted, and a small amount splashed onto the table and the father's sleeve. The girl gasped and quickly moved her notebook away from the spill. The cafe fell quiet. The man looked down at the table with annoyance. "You should watch where you're sitting," he said sharply. The father calmly reached for a napkin and wiped the coffee from the table. "It's all right," he said in a steady voice. "Accidents happen." But the man didn't walk away. Instead, he looked at the father more closely, as if deciding whether to start something. "You saying it's my fault?" he asked. The father shook his head slightly. "I didn't say that." The girl looked up nervously at her father. He noticed her expression and gave her a small, reassuring smile. "Finish your muffin," he told her quietly. But the man continued standing there. "You spilled my coffee," he said, even though most of the drink was still in his cup. The father spoke calmly again. "I'm sorry about that." The man stared at him for a moment, clearly expecting something else. Maybe an argument, maybe anger, but the father stayed calm. That seemed to annoy the man even more. "What kind of man just sits there like that?" he said loudly so others could hear. A few customers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The father slowly stood up from his chair. His movement was controlled and quiet. Up close, he was taller than most people in the room. His shoulders were broad, and his posture remained perfectly balanced, but his expression stayed calm. "I don't want any trouble," he said. The man laughed mockingly. "Yeah, I can see that." The daughter looked scared now. She held her notebook tightly against her chest. The father noticed and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "It's okay," he said softly. The man shook his head with a smirk. "You're apologizing like that in front of your kid?" The father didn't respond. The silence made the tension even heavier. Then suddenly, without warning, the man raised his hand and slapped the father across the face. The sharp sound echoed through the cafe. Several people gasped. The girl froze in shock. For a moment, no one moved. The father's head turned slightly from the force of the slap. A red mark slowly appeared on his cheek. The man looked around the room, almost proud of himself. "Maybe that'll wake you up," he said. Everyone expected the father to react. Some thought he would punch back. Others thought the situation would turn into a fight. But the father didn't move. He slowly turned his head back and looked down at his daughter. She looked close to tears. He knelt beside her chair, so he was at her eye level. His voice stayed calm. "Hey," he said gently. "Everything's okay." She whispered, "Why did he do that?" The father gave her a soft smile. Sometimes people have bad mornings. The cafe was completely silent now. The man standing behind them looked confused by the reaction. He clearly expected anger, shouting, something dramatic. Instead, the father simply picked up another napkin and wiped the coffee that had spilled earlier. His calmness felt strange, almost unnatural. The father then stood up again and faced a man. There was no anger in his face, just steady eyes. For a brief moment, the two men looked at each other. Something about the father's stillness made the room feel tense in a different way. But he said only one thing. "Please leave us alone." The man scoffed loudly. "Oh, you're serious?" He stepped closer, clearly enjoying the attention from the room. "You really think you can just sit here after that?" The father didn't answer. Instead, he moved slightly so his body stood between the man and his daughter. The movement was small but careful, almost protective. And although most people didn't notice it clearly, there was something different about the way he positioned himself. Balanced, ready, like someone who had spent years preparing for moments exactly like this. The girl looked up at him nervously while holding her backpack. The father gently squeezed her shoulder again. "Just stay here," he whispered. Behind them, the man laughed again. But the calm man standing in front of him was not as simple as he appeared. And the cafe was only moments away from learning that. The cafe remained completely silent after the slap. Even the soft music playing in the background suddenly felt too loud for the moment. Every person inside the room was watching the same scene, unsure what would happen next. The father stood calmly between the angry man and his daughter. One hand rested gently on the back of the girl's chair, almost like a quiet promise that she was safe. The red mark on his cheek was still visible, but his face showed no anger. His breathing stayed slow and steady. The man in front of him expected something very different. He expected shouting, maybe a pushback, maybe a fight. Instead, he saw a calm man who looked at him without fear. That calmness seemed to irritate him even more. "You just gonna stand there?" the man said loudly. The father didn't answer right away. He simply looked down at his daughter again. "Take your bag," he said softly to her. The girl nodded and quickly slipped her notebook inside her backpack. Her small hands were shaking a little. A woman sitting near the window watched the moment closely. She could see the way the father stayed close to the child, never taking his eyes fully off the situation around him. There was something careful about everything he did. The angry man stepped closer again. "You think you're tough or something?" he said. Still no answer. The father slowly guided his daughter, so she stood slightly behind him now. It looked natural, almost like a simple step to give her more space. But it also placed his body fully between her and the aggressive stranger. The man noticed and laughed. "Oh, I see. Playing the hero in front of your kid." A few customers exchanged nervous looks. The barista behind the counter whispered something to the manager, who was already moving toward the phone, unsure if the situation might turn worse. But the father still hadn't reacted. He looked at the man calmly and spoke in a quiet voice. "I said please leave us alone." The man leaned forward slightly, clearly enjoying the attention from everyone in the cafe. "What if I don't?" He suddenly reached forward and grabbed the front of the father's jacket. The movement happened fast. The daughter gasped softly. For the first time, the father's eyes changed slightly, not with anger, but with focus. The room seemed to freeze for a second. Then everything happened in a single smooth motion. The father's hand moved up and gently gripped the man's wrist. At the same time, he stepped slightly to side. The movement was quick, controlled, and almost effortless. Before anyone could understand what they were seeing, the aggressive man suddenly lost his balance. A second later, he was face down on the floor. A chair scraped loudly across the tiles as someone nearby stood up in shock. The father held the man's arm in a firm position behind his back, but he didn't press hard enough to hurt him, just enough so the man couldn't move. The entire cafe stared in disbelief. It had happened so quickly that most people barely saw the exact moment the situation changed. The man on the floor tried to push himself up, but immediately stopped when he realized he couldn't move his arm. "What are you doing?" he shouted. The father's voice remained calm. "Relax," he said. "I don't want to hurt you." The man struggled again, but the position kept him completely controlled. "Let me go." The father leaned slightly closer, so only the man could hear him clearly. "If you stop fighting, I'll let go." For a moment, the man stayed still. Then he finally stopped resisting. The father slowly released his arm and stepped back. The man quickly stood up and looked around the room. His face was now red with embarrassment. Several people had their phones out, quietly recording what had just happened. The man pointed angrily at the father. "You attacked me." The father calmly picked up the chair that had fallen during the moment and placed it back beside the table. "You grabbed me first," he said simply. The daughter watched her father with wide eyes. She had never seen him move like that before. To her, he was just a person who helped with homework and made breakfast in the mornings. Now, the people in the cafe looked at him differently. The aggressive man rubbed his arm and tried to act confident again, but his voice sounded less certain. "You think you're some kind of fighter?" he said. The father didn't respond. Instead, he turned back toward the table and picked up his daughter's backpack. "Are you ready?" he asked her gently. She nodded slowly, still processing what had just happened. The father took a napkin and wiped the last bit of coffee from the table. Then he helped the girl put on her backpack. The normal calmness of the moment felt strange after what everyone had just seen. It was as if he had already moved on. The angry man looked around the cafe again, noticing the attention he was getting now. But the attention had changed. Before, people were watching with nervous curiosity. Now, they were watching him with quiet judgment, and they were looking at the father with something closer to respect. The man didn't like that feeling. "You think this is over?" he said loudly. "I should call the police." The father shrugged slightly. "You can if you want." His voice stayed steady, without fear or challenge. The man pulled out his phone, but hesitated. He clearly wasn't expecting the father to stay so calm about it. Meanwhile, the daughter tugged lightly on her father's sleeve. "Are we going to school?" she whispered. He smiled gently. "Yes," he said. "We're almost ready." One of the older customers at a nearby table had been watching everything very carefully. He hadn't looked shocked like the others. Instead, he seemed thoughtful. His eyes followed the father's movements with quiet interest. The way the man stood, the way he stayed aware of every person in the room, and especially the way he had handled the situation on the floor just moments earlier. It wasn't the kind of movement someone learned in a regular self-defense class. It looked trained, very trained. The older customer leaned back in his chair and folded his arms while thinking. Across the room, The angry man finally put his phone back in his pocket. His confidence seemed to fade a little now. The father finished helping his daughter adjust her backpack straps. Then he reached for his coffee cup and took one last calm sip. The cafe was still watching. Some people whispered quietly. Others simply stared. The barista looked relieved that the situation had calmed down for the moment, but the tension in the room hadn't fully disappeared. The father placed the empty cup on the table and gently took his daughter's hand. "Let's go," he said. But before they could leave, the older customer at the nearby table finally spoke. His voice was calm but curious. "Excuse me." The father paused and turned slightly. The older man studied him carefully for a moment. Then he asked a simple question. "Were you ever in the military?" The room became quiet again. The father looked at the man for a moment without answering. For the first time, a small hint of hesitation crossed his face. It was a short pause, but it was enough to make the moment feel important. Finally, he gave a small nod. "A long time ago," he said. The older man's eyes narrowed slightly, as if he had just confirmed something he suspected, because what everyone had witnessed a few minutes earlier didn't look like luck. It looked like training, serious training. And the quiet single father standing in that small cafe was starting to seem like someone with a much deeper story than anyone expected. The cafe stayed quiet after the older customer asked the question. The father stood near the table with his daughter's small hand still resting in his. The room felt different now. It wasn't only tension anymore. It was curiosity. Several people were now looking at him in a new way. The older man who had asked the question leaned slightly forward in his chair. His eyes were sharp but not unfriendly. He looked like someone who had lived a long life and had learned to notice small details others missed. The father gave a short nod after the question. "A long time ago," he repeated calmly. The answer was simple, but it made the older man study him even more closely. "I thought so," the older man said quietly. The aggressive man standing nearby scoffed loudly when he heard this. "Oh, great," he said sarcastically. "Now we're pretending he's some kind of soldier?" He looked around the cafe, hoping someone would laugh with him, but no one did. People were still remembering how quickly the situation on the floor had changed earlier. The way the father moved had not looked like luck. The father didn't respond to the comment. Instead, he adjusted his daughter's backpack straps again to make sure they were comfortable. "Ready?" he asked her softly. She nodded, though she kept glancing back at the angry man with nervous eyes. The father gently squeezed her shoulder. "Don't worry," he said quietly. "Everything's fine." But the man wasn't ready to let the moment end. He stepped closer again, still rubbing his arm where it had been pinned earlier. "You think that little trick back there impressed people?" he said loudly. The father looked at him calmly. "You should just go," he replied. The words were simple. There was no challenge in his voice, only quiet advice. But the man heard it differently. "You telling me what to do now?" he said. The cafe manager stepped forward carefully, trying to calm things down before the situation grew worse. "Sir," the manager said politely to the aggressive man, "maybe it's best if everyone just goes their own way." The man turned toward the manager with an irritated look. "You saw what happened," he said. "This guy attacked me." The manager hesitated. Several customers immediately spoke up. "That's not true," one woman said. "You grabbed him first," another customer added. Someone near the door even raised the phone slightly. "I recorded part of it," the person said. The man looked around and realized the room was no longer on his side. His confidence dropped a little, but his pride didn't let him back down easily. Meanwhile, the older customer slowly stood from his chair. He walked a few steps closer to the father. "Your movement earlier," the older man said calmly, "that wasn't something people forget." The father looked slightly uncomfortable with the attention. "It was nothing," he replied. But the older man shook his head. "No," he said, "it wasn't nothing." The man studied him again, noticing the calm posture, the steady breathing, and the quiet awareness of everything around him. "You didn't panic," the older man continued. "You protected your child first. Then you controlled the situation without hurting anyone." He gave a small, thoughtful nod. "That kind of control takes years of training." The father didn't answer. Across the room, the aggressive man rolled his eyes again. "You two done talking?" he said. But now the cafe customers were whispering among themselves. Some people were trying to guess what kind of military training the quiet father might have had. Others simply watched him with curiosity. At that moment, the daughter looked up at him. "Dad," she whispered softly. He leaned down slightly so he could hear her. "Are we going to be late for school?" The simple question seemed to break the tension for a moment. The father smiled. "Not yet," he said. He reached for the girl's small hand again. But before they could walk toward the door, the older customer spoke once more. "You don't have to answer if you don't want to," he said carefully. "But I've worked around military people before." The father looked at him quietly. The older man continued. "The way you moved, it reminded me of someone I knew years ago." The father said nothing. The older man gave a small, respectful nod. "Special operations," he added softly. The words made several people in the cafe look up. The aggressive man laughed loudly. "Oh, come on," he said. "Now he's a secret agent too?" But the older man ignored him. Instead, he kept looking at the father. For a few seconds, the room stayed completely still. Finally, the father gave a quiet sigh. He clearly didn't enjoy being the center of attention. "It was a long time ago," he repeated again. The answer was still careful, but it didn't fully deny what the older man had suggested. The aggressive man folded his arms. "Sure," he said mockingly. "Next you'll say you were in some elite unit." The father didn't react, but the daughter looked up proudly. "My dad used to help people," she said. Her voice was small but confident. The cafe customers smiled softly at the comment. The father gently patted her shoulder. "That's enough," he said kindly. But the older man's eyes showed even more interest now. He had been studying the father's face carefully. Then something seemed to click in his memory. "Wait," the older man said slowly. He stepped a little closer and looked at the father again. "Have we met before?" The father shook his head. "I don't think so." But the older man continued thinking. "I used to work logistics support for military operations," he explained. "Years ago." A few customers listened with growing curiosity. The man continued speaking slowly as he searched his memory. "Sometimes we saw teams coming back from missions. Quiet groups. Very disciplined." He looked at the father again. "You remind me of one of those men." The father looked slightly uncomfortable again. "I'm just a dad now," he said simply. The daughter smiled at that. "Yes," she said happily. But the aggressive man was becoming more frustrated. He felt the situation slipping away from him. Instead of being the strong one in the room, he was slowly becoming the embarrassing one. He pointed at the father again. "You think everyone's impressed by your little story?" The father didn't answer. Instead, he bent slightly to zip his daughter's backpack properly. Then he spoke quietly to her. "We should really get going." The girl nodded, but just before they walked away, the older man pulled out his phone. "Sorry," he said politely. "One last thing." The father paused. The older man typed something quickly on his phone screen. He seemed to be searching for something. A few seconds passed. Then his eyes widened slightly. He looked up at the father again with clear surprise. "Well," he said quietly. The cafe customers leaned forward with curiosity. The older man turned his phone screen slightly so he could read it better. "There's a photo here," he said slowly. The father remained silent. The older man studied the image again, comparing it carefully to the man standing in front of him. Then he let out a quiet breath. "I thought you looked familiar," he said. The aggressive man rolled his eyes again. "What now?" he asked. The older man finally looked at him. "You might want to calm down," he said calmly. The man laughed again. "Why?" The older man raised his phone slightly. "Because the man you slapped earlier," he said. He paused for a moment. Then he finished the sentence quietly. "Used to serve in Delta Force." The words seemed to freeze the room. Several people gasped softly. The aggressive man's smile slowly faded. He looked at the father again, this time with uncertainty. The quiet single dad standing in the cafe doorway looked exactly the same as before. Simple clothes, calm expression, one hand gently holding his daughter's hand. But now the entire room understood something they hadn't realized before. The man they had just watched calmly avoid a fight was someone who had once faced much bigger dangers. And suddenly the slap from earlier didn't seem brave anymore. It seemed like a very big mistake. For a few seconds after the older man spoke, the cafe felt completely frozen. The words hung in the air like something heavy. Delta Force. Most people in the room had heard the name before. Even if they didn't fully understand what it meant, they knew it was something serious. Something connected to the most dangerous missions in the military. The aggressive man slowly looked from the older man's phone back to the quiet father standing near the door. His confident expression was gone now. "You're joking," he said, but his voice no longer sounded sure. The older man shook his head slowly. "I don't joke about things like that." He looked at the father again, almost with respect. "You were part of that unit, weren't you?" The father didn't answer right away. His daughter squeezed his hand gently, unaware of the weight of the moment around them. Finally, he gave a small nod. "It was a long time ago," he said. The room became even quieter. Some customers exchanged surprised looks. The woman who had been sitting near the window whispered softly to the person beside her, "That explains a lot." Another customer leaned closer to see the phone screen the older man was holding. On it was a small photo from an old news article. It showed a group of soldiers standing together somewhere overseas. Their faces were serious, their gear heavy. One of those faces looked very similar to the quiet father standing in the cafe. The aggressive man's shoulders dropped slightly. "You're serious?" he said again. The father looked at him calmly. "Yes." But his voice carried no pride, no attempt to impress anyone. It sounded like he was simply stating an old fact that no longer mattered much to him. The cafe manager slowly lowered the phone he had been holding earlier, realizing the situation had taken a very unexpected turn. A young man sitting near the door whispered to his friend, "That guy could have destroyed him earlier." His friend nodded, but he didn't. That seemed to be the detail everyone kept thinking about. The father had been slapped. He had been grabbed, but he never attacked. He only stopped the situation when he had no other choice. The aggressive man rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly now. "Well, that still doesn't change what happened," he said, trying to sound confident again. But even he didn't seem to believe his own words. The father looked at him for a moment. "You're right," he said calmly. "It doesn't." That answer surprised several people. The aggressive man blinked. "What do you mean?" The father gently adjusted his daughter's backpack again before speaking. "It doesn't change anything," he repeated. "You had a bad moment. That happens." The room grew quiet again. Most people expected anger, or maybe a speech about respect. But the father simply spoke as if the situation was already behind him. The older man watching nearby crossed his arms thoughtfully. "You must have seen a lot during your service," he said. The father nodded slightly. "Enough." The older man studied him again. "And now?" The father looked down at his daughter. "Now I make breakfast, help with homework, and try not to be late for school drop-offs." The daughter smiled proudly at that. Some customers in the cafe laughed softly. The simple answer somehow made the moment feel even more powerful. The aggressive man shifted uncomfortably where he stood. For the first time since entering the cafe, he seemed unsure what to do. "You're just going to walk away?" he asked. The father looked at him. "Yes." "You're not angry?" The father thought for a moment. "Anger doesn't help much," he said. He gently placed his hand on his daughter's shoulder. "When you've seen real problems in life, small fights stop feeling important." The words were quiet but honest. The aggressive man stared at him. It was clear he didn't know how to respond. Around them, the cafe customers watched with quiet attention. The older man lowered his phone and placed it back into his pocket. "You handled that situation better than most people would," he said respectfully. The father shrugged slightly. "I just didn't want my daughter to be scared." The girl looked up at him again. "I wasn't scared," she said softly. He smiled. "Maybe just a little." She giggled. The moment broke some of the tension in the room. Even the barista behind the counter relaxed a little. But the aggressive man still stood there, clearly thinking about everything that had just happened. Finally, he spoke again, though his voice sounded very different now. "I didn't know." The father nodded. "That's okay." The man looked at the floor briefly. "I shouldn't have hit you." The apology was quiet and awkward, but it was real. The father studied him for a moment. Then he gave a small nod. Thank you for saying that. The aggressive man exhaled slowly. Some of the tension in his shoulders finally disappeared. The cafe manager stepped forward again, wanting to make sure everything was truly finished. All right, he said gently. Let's all take a breath. A few customers chuckled quietly. The father looked down at his daughter again. We should really go now. She nodded eagerly. I don't want to be late. He took her hand and turned toward the door. But before leaving, the older man spoke one last time. Thank you for your service, he said sincerely. The father paused for a moment. Then he nodded politely. Thank you. The aggressive man also spoke up again, this time with a completely different tone. Hey, he said. The father looked back. The man hesitated before finishing his sentence. Sorry again. The father gave a calm nod. Take care of yourself. Then he opened the cafe door. The morning sunlight spilled into the room again. He stepped outside with his daughter beside him. Inside the cafe, the customers slowly began talking again. Many of them were still trying to process what they had just witnessed. The older man sat back down in his chair, shaking his head slightly in amazement. Not many people walk away from situations like that, he murmured. A nearby customer asked quietly, You really think it was Delta Force? The older man smiled slightly. I'm certain. He glanced toward the door where the father and daughter had just disappeared. And the most impressive part, he added softly, is that he clearly doesn't want anyone to know. Outside on the sidewalk, the father and daughter walked toward the school at the end of the street. The girl looked up at him curiously. Dad. Yes. Were you really in that special team? He thought for a moment before answering. Something like that. Her eyes widened with excitement. Did you go on missions? He smiled gently. A few. She looked impressed. Were they scary? The father looked down at her small hand, holding his. Sometimes, he said honestly. But the important thing is that I'm here now. She smiled and squeezed his hand tighter. They continued walking down the quiet street together. Behind them, the cafe slowly returned to its normal peaceful rhythm. But everyone inside would remember that morning for a long time, because they had seen something rare. A man with incredible strength who chose peace instead of pride. And that kind of strength was far more powerful than any fight. The morning sun had climbed higher in the sky by the time the father and his daughter reached the end of the street. The small school building stood just across the road, surrounded by a few trees and a playground that was slowly filling with children. Parents stood near the gate, saying goodbye to their kids before the day began. Some children laughed and ran toward their friends, while others walked quietly into the building. The father slowed his steps as they approached the entrance. The girl adjusted her backpack again and looked up at him. Are you still thinking about the cafe? She asked. He smiled a little. Not really, he said. Are you? She shrugged. Maybe a little. He crouched slightly so they were at the same height. What are you thinking about? He asked. She hesitated for a moment. Why that man was so angry. The father thought about the question carefully before answering. Sometimes people carry problems we can't see, he said gently. And when they don't know how to deal with those problems, the anger comes out in the wrong places. The girl listened closely. So he wasn't really angry at you? Probably not, the father replied. She looked thoughtful. Do you think he'll be nicer now? The father smiled softly. I hope so. They reached the school gate, where a teacher stood greeting the students as they arrived. The father gave a polite wave. The girl hugged him quickly. See you later, she said. Have a good day, he replied. She turned and ran toward the playground where a few of her friends were already waiting. Within seconds, she was laughing again, the morning incident already fading from her mind. The father watched for a moment to make sure she was safe inside the school grounds. Then he turned and began walking back toward the cafe street. The neighborhood was busy now. Cars passed slowly along the road, and people walked to work carrying coffee cups and bags. His face looked calm again, as if nothing unusual had happened earlier that morning. But inside the cafe, the story of what had happened was still spreading from table to table. The older man who had recognized him was now sitting with two other customers who had asked him more questions. You really think he was part of that unit? One of them asked. The older man nodded confidently. I'm certain. How can you tell? The older man leaned back in his chair. I spent years around military operations. You learn to recognize certain things. The way someone stands. The way they react under pressure. He gestured lightly toward the door where the father had left earlier. That man didn't panic for a second, even after being slapped. The other customer nodded slowly. That's true. And the way he controlled that guy on the floor, the older man continued. That wasn't random. The cafe manager joined the conversation while wiping down the counter. I thought it was going to turn into a fight, the manager admitted. But it didn't, the older man replied. That's the difference. Across the room, the aggressive man still sat at a table near the door. His coffee had gone cold. He hadn't left yet. Instead, he stared quietly at the table, thinking about everything that had happened. The moment of the slap replayed in his mind again and again. But now the memory felt different. At first, he had felt powerful. Now, he only felt embarrassed. He remembered the calm look on the father's face, the way he had spoken without anger, the way he had protected his daughter without trying to prove anything to the room. It made the aggressive man feel smaller the more he thought about it. He looked around the cafe. Some people still glanced at him occasionally, not with fear, not with respect, just quiet disappointment. He sighed heavily and stood up from his chair. The barista noticed him approaching the counter again. Can I help you with something? She asked politely. The man hesitated before answering. Is the guy with the kid still around? The barista shook her head. They left a while ago. The man nodded slowly. Yeah, I figured. He reached into his pocket and placed some money on the counter for the coffee he had barely touched. Then he turned toward the door. Outside, the street was bright with morning activity. The man stood there for a moment, thinking. Part of him wanted to forget the whole thing. But another part of him couldn't stop thinking about the quiet strength he had seen that morning. He muttered softly to himself. That guy could have wrecked me. But he hadn't. That was the part that stayed in his mind the most. Meanwhile, a few blocks away, the father walked into a small grocery store. He picked up a few items from the shelves, milk, bread, and fruit for later in the day. The cashier greeted him politely. Good morning. Morning, he replied. His calm voice gave no sign of the earlier incident to the people around him. He looked like any other parent running errands after dropping off a child at school. He paid for the groceries and stepped back outside. As he walked home, he noticed a quiet neighborhood again. Birds sat on power lines. A dog barked in the distance. Life continued in its simple rhythm. When he reached his house, he placed the groceries on the kitchen counter and poured himself another cup of coffee. For a moment, he stood near the window, looking out at the street. His mind briefly returned to the cafe, not with anger, just reflection. He had spent many years in places where small conflicts could become very serious very quickly. Back then, every decision mattered. Every movement had consequences. Those years had taught him something important. Real strength wasn't about winning fights. It was about knowing when not to fight. A few hours later, the school day ended. Children filled the sidewalks again, talking loudly about their classes and playground games. The father waited near the gate like he always did. When his daughter saw him, she ran toward him with a big smile. Dad, how was school? He asked. Good. She grabbed his hand as they began walking home. Halfway down the street, she suddenly asked another question. Dad. Yes. If someone is mean, what should I do? He thought about the question carefully. First, he said, try to stay calm. She nodded. And if they keep being mean, then you walk away if you can. She looked curious. What if you can't walk away? The father smiled gently. Then you stand your ground, but only enough to protect yourself. She seemed satisfied with that answer. They continued walking together. The sun slowly moved lower in the sky, and the neighborhood began to grow quieter again. The daughter suddenly smiled up at him. I'm glad you're my dad. He squeezed her hand lightly. I'm glad you're my kid. Back at the cafe, the older man finally finished his coffee and prepared to leave. As he stepped outside, he looked down the street where the father and daughter had walked earlier that morning. He shook his head slightly with a quiet smile. Funny thing about real heroes, he murmured to himself. They usually look like ordinary people. Then he walked away, leaving the cafe behind. But the story of that morning stayed with everyone who had been there, because they had witnessed something rare. Not just strength, but the kind of strength that chooses patience, kindness, and peace, even when it would be much easier to fight.